Winter, 1943. A long freight train screeches to a halt somewhere in the heart of America, pine forests on the horizon, snow drifting across the open field. The men inside the rail cars are silent, their uniforms torn, faces hollow from months of fighting in North Africa. German soldiers, prisoners of the Reich, now thousands of miles from home, they step down cautiously, expecting snarling guards, barking dogs, and rifle butts to the back. For weeks, Nazi propaganda had told them what awaited in America: starvation, torture, humiliation at the hands of vengeful victors, but instead, they see something else entirely. Local farmers watching from the fence line. Curious children perched on a wooden fence, waving. A Red Cross truck parked beside neat rows of tents. Smells of coffee and bread drift through the cold air. The guards, young Americans, barely older than the prisoners, carry no hatred in their eyes. The Germans exchange glances of confusion. One mutters under his breath, "This can't be real." They had braced for cruelty. What they found instead was a quiet, unsettling kindness, the kind that made them question everything they had believed. The long war was far from over. But for these men, a different kind of battle had just begun. When the United States entered World War II in December 1941, few imagined that within 3 years, hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers would be living peacefully on American soil. Yet by 1945, more than 425,000 Axis prisoners of war, mostly Germans, but also Italians and Japanese, were scattered across 700 camps throughout the United States. The journey that brought them there began in the deserts of North Africa. In 1942, as Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps pushed toward Egypt, Allied forces, led by Britain and, soon after, America, launched Operation Torch. It was the U.S. Army's first major engagement of the war. The fighting was fierce, chaotic, and brutal under the relentless Saharan sun when Rommel's lines finally collapsed in Tunisia in May 1943. Over 250,000 Axis troops surrendered, a massive blow to Hitler's ambitions. But now the Allies had a new problem: what to do with so many prisoners. Britain, already strained by bombings and food shortages, had no capacity to house them. So, the Americans offered a solution. The prisoners would be shipped across the Atlantic, far from the front lines, far from escape, and far from the chaos of war. At first, -1 U.S. officials were uneasy about bringing enemy soldiers into the homeland. There were fears of sabotage, spying, or violence. Newspapers questioned the wisdom of letting Nazis roam American soil, but under the Geneva Convention of 1929, the United States had a legal and moral duty to care for captured soldiers humanely. So, beginning in 1943, convoys of Liberty ships departed from Oran, Algiers, and Casablanca, loaded not with ammunition or tanks but with German soldiers. Each ship carried hundreds of men across the rough Atlantic, under the watch of U.S. Navy escorts to guard against U-boat attacks. For many of these soldiers, it was their first glimpse of the enemy homeland. They had been told that America was decadent, chaotic, a nation of mongrels and weaklings. The Reich's propaganda machine had portrayed Americans as spoiled industrialists who hid behind machines and money rather than courage. As the ships neared the American coast, the prisoners looked out from the decks expecting ruins or chaos. Instead, they saw untouched skylines, vast stretches of farmland, and the glow of cities unscarred by war. No bomb craters, no rubble, just factories humming and trains gliding through the landscape. When the ships docked, often in New York, Norfolk, or New Orleans, the Germans were astonished by the sheer scale of everything. The docks teemed with cargo, cranes, and soldiers, yet everything ran in quiet efficiency. Even the guards seemed relaxed, unafraid. After brief processing, they were loaded onto trains bound for camps in Texas, Alabama, Kansas, and the Dakotas. For most, the train ride lasted days, crossing forests, deserts, and farmlands that seemed to stretch forever. Every station, every town they passed looked alive and thriving. One prisoner later recalled, "We had been told America was dying from chaos and corruption. Instead, we saw a land at peace, untouched, full of food, and people smiling. We realized the war was lost long before Berlin did. These early impressions planted the first seeds of doubt among men who had grown up under Nazi propaganda. If this was what the enemy's country looked like, then perhaps everything they'd been told about superiority, about destiny, had been a lie. The camps they would arrive in would soon confirm that realization in ways they never expected. The trains that carried the German prisoners rolled deep into the heart of America, through the plains of Kansas, the pine forests of Louisiana, the flatlands of Texas, and the quiet countryside of Iowa. What awaited them was not barbed wire cruelty, but something far more disorienting: order, decency, and humanity. Most POW camps were built hastily by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, often on unused farmland or near existing military bases. Camp Swift in Texas, Camp McCain in Mississippi, Camp Concordia in Kansas each became a small, self-contained world of its own. The camps were surrounded by tall fences and guard towers, but life inside them was remarkably structured. The United States, adhering strictly to the Geneva Convention, provided POWs with shelter, medical care, and even recreation. German prisoners were paid small wages for labor, received mail from home, and were allowed to organize music, theater, and even sports. Too many of them, it was surreal. Back in Europe, millions of civilians, including their own families, lived under constant bombing and hunger. Yet here, in the country they had been told was barbaric, they were given bread, coffee, cigarettes, and warm blankets. A German private named Friedrich Becker, captured in North Africa and sent to a camp in Texas, later said, "It was the first time I ate until I was full. The guards treated us fairly. It confused us. We did not understand how our enemies could be so human." Most prisoners worked on local farms, replacing American men who had gone to the front lines. Under supervision, they picked cotton, harvested wheat, and built irrigation ditches. Farmers often greeted them politely, sometimes offering food or conversation. What began as suspicion slowly turned into a strange kind of respect. Some POWs even helped rebuild barns destroyed by storms or repaired machinery for locals. One Kansas farmer later told reporters they worked hard. "You'd never think these boys were supposed to be our enemies." Meanwhile, American civilians were equally surprised. They had imagined German soldiers as ruthless, cold, and mechanical, the face of tyranny. But what they saw were young men, many barely out of school, doing farm work with quiet discipline. For both sides, stereotypes began to dissolve. Cultural programs and education soon followed. The U.S. War Department, recognizing the potential for re-education, introduced denazification lectures, English classes, and films about democracy and freedom. Not all prisoners were receptive. Some die-hard Nazis resisted, forming underground groups within the camps. But for many, it was their first exposure to ideas that had been banned back home. By 1944, as the Allies advanced into France and Germany's defeat loomed, more POWs began to question everything they once believed. They listened to American news broadcasts, read newspapers under supervision, and realized the truth of Germany's crumbling empire. Letters from home painted a darker picture: bombed-out cities, rationing, fear. Many of the prisoners began to feel guilt and confusion. Here they were, eating well and sleeping safely, while their families endured ruin, yet some found meaning in small acts. A group of prisoners in Camphern, Texas, built a miniature theater, performing plays from Goethe and Schiller. Others carved chess sets from scrap wood or painted landscapes of the Texas horizon. It was their way of staying human and perhaps of making sense of a war that no longer did. The American Guards, too, evolved. At first, they were cautious, even hostile, but discipline and mutual respect prevailed. Friendships, unspoken and fragile, began to form. When Christmas came, some guards shared rations and cigarettes with the prisoners. Choirs sang in both English and German for many of the POWs. It was the first Christmas they had spent in peace since 1939. By the end of 1944, The war in Europe was turning decisively in favor of the Allies. News of the Normandy landings, the liberation of Paris, and the Soviet advance filled the camps. The men who once shouted Heil Hitler during roll call now sat in silence, their belief in the Reich eroding day by day. And as that realization sank in, their perception of America and of themselves began to change forever. What makes this story so haunting is not only that German prisoners lived in America during the height of the Second World War, but that many of them changed there. The transformation was subtle, almost invisible at first, but profound in its depth. Within the fences of the POW camps, surrounded by a country they had been taught to despise, many of these men began to see the world and themselves differently. To understand why, one must begin with the shock of decency. For soldiers raised under Nazi propaganda, America was supposed to be decadent, chaotic, and weak, a land of mongrels and materialists ruled by greed and disorder. Yet, when they arrived, hungry and broken from the front, what they encountered was structure, fairness, and something far more disarming, kindness. A corporal named Heinz Müller, captured in Tunisia and sent to a camp in Oklahoma, wrote later in his journal, "We expected to be beaten. Instead, they gave us bread and coffee. We expected hatred. Instead, they gave us work." It is difficult to hate a people who treat you better than your own officers ever did. That reversal, the enemy behaving more humanely than one's own regime, began to erode the ideological armor many prisoners carried. They were confronted with a moral contradiction. The Reich that had promised them greatness had led them to defeat, while the enemy gave them dignity. The American guards enforced discipline, but with restraint. They were firm but not cruel, fair but not servile. The POWs were paid for their labor, allowed to write home, and even encouraged to study. For many, this was their first exposure to freedom within confinement, a paradox that left deep marks on their minds. Sociologists, who later studied these camps, found that the process of reorientation among POWs often followed three stages: disbelief, curiosity, and internal conflict. First came disbelief, the refusal to accept that the propaganda had been false. Then curiosity, the desire to understand how a democracy could function with such efficiency. And finally, internal conflict, the painful realization that they had fought and killed for a lie. Inside the camps, small cultural revolutions began. Prisoners formed discussion circles, wrote plays, and read American newspapers under supervision. Many began learning English, not only to pass time, but out of genuine fascination. The most curious of them, teachers, engineers, musicians, started to see America not as an enemy, but as an idea. For them, the camp became an unexpected classroom. They studied the concept of individual rights, debated the flaws of totalitarianism, and observed, in the daily routines of their captors, what democratic order looked like in practice. Some guards even brought books, Twain, Steinbeck, Shakespeare, to those who asked. One officer in Camp Shelby reportedly smuggled in a copy of the U.S. Constitution for a group of prisoners who wanted to understand how a government could exist without fear. At the same time, the camps were not without tension. A number of fanatical Nazis, refusing to accept defeat, sought to preserve Hitler's ideology behind the fences. They bullied or attacked fellow prisoners who expressed sympathy for America or criticized the Reich. In some camps, small underground cells of true believers maintained secret tribunals to punish traitors, but as the war turned decisively against Germany, their influence waned. The collapse of the homeland broke their authority. When letters from Germany described destruction, hunger, and death, the myth of the invincible Reich evaporated. And in that psychological vacuum, a new identity began to take root. Many prisoners started to imagine a different Germany, one that could coexist with, rather than dominate, the world. Some wrote poems or essays about what freedom might mean in a post-war Europe. Others vowed to bring home what they had learned in captivity, that power need not rest on fear, and that respect could be earned without violence. In this way, the POW camps became incubators of moral reflection. Behind barbed wire, the men who once marched under the swastika found space to question their own obedience. This transformation was not universal. Not every prisoner changed. But for a significant number, America planted an idea they could never unlearn. A lieutenant who later returned to Bavaria recalled years later, "In the camp, I saw what decency looked like. I saw that strength could exist without cruelty. When I went home, I could no longer believe in the old Germany. That was the quiet revolution of the camps, not political indoctrination, but exposure to normalcy." The prisoners discovered that freedom was not chaos, that equality was not weakness, and that democracy could function without terror. By the time the war ended and the gates opened for repatriation, many of them left America not merely as defeated soldiers, but as men reborn into doubt, humility, and reflection. Some would later rebuild Germany as teachers, engineers, or community leaders. A few even returned to the United States to live, drawn by the very land that had once held them captive, and though they scattered across continents, they carried a shared paradox that it was in captivity that they had first learned what it meant to be free. While German prisoners were discovering a new vision of the world behind the wire, the transformation was not one-sided. Across rural America, towns, guards, and civilians were undergoing their own quiet awakening. At first, fear dominated. For most Americans, the idea of thousands of captured Germans living nearby was unsettling. Men who had fought for Hitler, who had bombed London, who had marched through Europe under the Black Cross. Yet, as these prisoners arrived, sunburned, thin, and bewildered, that fear began to soften into something else: curiosity, and eventually humanity. In small towns across Texas, Alabama, and Nebraska, POW camps became unexpected neighbors. Farmers, short of labor because so many young Americans were overseas, began to hire German prisoners to work the fields under Army supervision. The arrangement was practical, but it soon grew personal. Local families would watch as the enemy helped harvest their wheat, repair fences, or build barns. They saw them joke, sing, and sweat like any young man. The farmers paid the government a standard rate, and the POWs received a small wage, often spent at camp canteens to buy cigarettes or soap. It was humble, honest work, and it humanized both sides. Reports from that era tell of small gestures that broke the walls of hate. A farmer's wife leaving extra food at the edge of a field. A guard looking the other way when prisoners shared stories with local kids in broken English. A captured soldier offering to fix a tractor as thanks for a kind word. These were not acts of rebellion, they were acts of decency, and they reshaped the American understanding of their adversaries. Many guards, initially hardened by training and propaganda, were young men themselves, 19, 20 years old, far from home, uncertain of their own role. Some had brothers fighting in Europe. They expected monsters. They found boys much like themselves. One guard from Kansas later said they were polite, proud, sometimes stubborn, but they weren't devils. The war told us they were evil, but war lies. I learned that up close. It was a lesson repeated across dozens of states. At Camp Swift in Texas, guards organized soccer matches between Americans and Germans, drawing local crowds. At Camp Hallisville, Alabama, prisoners performed orchestral concerts that townsfolk attended, their music filling the night air of a small southern town with Beethoven and Brahms. These moments were quiet, even fragile, but they carried immense symbolic weight. Each one challenged the simple narrative of good versus evil. Still, not everyone approved. Some newspapers questioned why prisoners were treated so well when American boys were dying overseas. Families who had lost sons in Normandy or the Pacific felt that kindness to Germans was an insult to sacrifice. And yet, the War Department held firm. The Geneva Convention had to be respected. America would not descend to the moral level of its enemies. That decision, rooted in law and principle, became an act of national identity. The humane treatment of German POWs wasn't merely mercy. It was proof that democracy could remain honorable even under the strain of total war. For many civilians, especially in rural America, those camps were their first exposure to foreigners. to European culture, to the complexity of the enemy. The experience subtly shifted how ordinary people saw the world. Children who met German prisoners as farm helpers grew up remembering them not as Nazis, but as individuals, men who missed their families, who loved music, who carved wooden toys in their spare time. Decades later, some of those children would still recall the strange warmth of those encounters. For the American soldiers guarding them, it was an education in restraint. They learned that justice required discipline, not vengeance. They learned that strength could coexist with empathy. Many would carry that understanding home, shaping their post-war lives and attitudes. In letters written home by both guards and prisoners, a shared sentiment often appeared: respect. Not agreement. Not forgiveness, but respect for the shared humanity revealed when war stripped away ideology. This mutual recognition did not erase the horrors of the war or the crimes of the regime those prisoners had served, but it laid the groundwork for what would come later: reconciliation. When the camps finally closed and the prisoners were sent home, both sides felt a strange emptiness. The guards had grown accustomed to the routine, the quiet understanding built over time. The farmers lost their seasonal workers and, in some cases, unlikely friends. A few prisoners wrote back from Germany, sending letters of thanks or photos of rebuilt homes. Some Americans kept those letters for the rest of their lives, reminders of a time when enemies had become, if not friends, at least fellow men. It was a small piece of peace inside the great machinery of war, a moral victory hidden behind barbed wire. And as the war drew to its inevitable end, both prisoner and guard stood on the edge of a new world, uncertain of what it would become. But they shared a truth that would endure long after the battles had faded: that even in war, humanity could survive. By April 1945, the war that had once seemed endless was collapsing with dizzying speed. The Reich was dying. Cities were in ruins, German divisions were shattered, and the once proud Wehrmacht was disintegrating under the combined weight of the Allied onslaught. Yet, in the quiet fields of America, tens of thousands of German prisoners still lived in a strange limbo, cut off from home, unaware of what remained of their country. Inside the barbed wire of Camphorn, Texas, and dozens of other American POW sites, rumors began to spread. The guards were tense but silent. Newspapers were kept away. Radios played cautiously censored news. Still, whispers seeped through. Berlin was encircled. Hitler was dead. The war was over. For the prisoners, disbelief came first. The idea that the Führer, the man they had been told was invincible, the symbol of Germany's destiny, was gone, was almost unthinkable. Then, as the reality sank in, came a quiet devastation. They gathered in the dusty parade grounds under the vast American sky and asked the same question over and over: what happens to us now? Some cheered. These were men who had long despised the war, who had seen its madness firsthand. For them, Germany's surrender was liberation, not defeat. Others, still loyal to the regime's dying myth, wept openly or stood in stunned silence. That night, in one camp in Georgia, guards reported that a group of prisoners held an impromptu funeral for Hitler: a candle, a prayer, and a crude wooden cross. The next morning, another group tore it down, calling it a grave for lies. The divide among the prisoners was clear, between those who still clung to the dream of the Reich and those who saw what it had truly cost for the Americans. The end of the war brought a new challenge. What should be done with more than 370,000 German prisoners now that hostilities had ceased? The Geneva Convention was clear: prisoners must be repatriated when the war ended. But the logistics were immense, and the political situation in Europe was chaotic. So the camps waited. For the first time, guards unlocked the gates during daylight hours and let the prisoners roam freely within the perimeter. Watchtowers that once held rifles now stood empty. Soldiers who had once barked orders now chatted casually with the men they once guarded. The atmosphere was surreal, like a stage after the actors had left. But the set remained. Some camps began dismantling fences. Others allowed prisoners to write freely to their families in Europe. Letters trickled in from the Red Cross, carrying the broken story of a nation in ruins. Villages flattened, families scattered, cities like Dresden and Hamburg reduced to ash. The German POWs, who had spent years surrounded by abundance, well-fed, well-clothed, and largely safe, suddenly realized what awaited them beyond the ocean. One prisoner later wrote, "We had hated America for its power, but when we learned what had become of our homes, we feared going back more than we ever feared captivity." For months, they had lived in a world where food was plentiful, roofs were solid, and the nights were peaceful. Now they faced return to a wasteland, a Germany divided and starving. Some began to help the Americans dismantle the camps, not as prisoners but as workers. They painted barracks, packed equipment, even trained guards in basic German phrases to use in Europe. At Camp Shanks, New York, trains loaded with POWs began rolling toward the ports. Each man carried a small bundle, a blanket, some cigarettes, and a Red Cross ration pack. As they boarded ships bound for a broken homeland, they stood silently on deck, looking back at the distant outline of the American coast fading into mist. One American guard, watching them depart, later recalled, "They didn't cheer or sing like victors. They didn't look beaten either. They just stared, like men stepping into an uncertain dawn." The irony was painful. They had come to America as enemies, expecting hatred and suffering. Instead, they had found dignity, work, even a sense of order. Now, they were returning to their homeland, only to face chaos. For some, the realization was unbearable. A few tried to delay their repatriation, volunteering for extra work or medical recovery programs. Others asked quietly, hopelessly, if they could stay in America. The answer, of course, was no. By late 1946, most German POWs in the United States had been shipped back across the Atlantic. Their ships docked at Le Havre, France, or Southampton, England, where they were processed by Allied authorities before being sent to various occupations zones in Germany. And when they finally set foot on German soil again, the shock was overwhelming. Factories were gutted, railways twisted like skeletons, entire neighborhoods were gone, replaced by mountains of rubble. The once proud cities they remembered had been transformed into silent graveyards of stone. Many of them, still wearing clean American-issued uniforms, stood out among the ragged crowds of civilians. Some were jeered at by fellow Germans, blamed for losing the war, for being captured instead of dying for the Reich. It was in that moment, among the ruins of their own making, that many finally understood what America had shown them behind barbed wire, not victory or humiliation, but something far deeper: the difference between tyranny and freedom. For them, captivity had been an education, and its lessons would echo for decades to come. The ships carrying the German POWs docked at ports under gray skies, the kind of skies that hung over Europe in 1946, heavy with loss. The air smelled of coal smoke and salt. For many, it was their first breath of German air in years. But it was not the Germany they had left. From Le Havre to Bremen, from Southampton to Cuxhaven, thousands of men stepped off the gangways with quiet disbelief. The cities that once symbolized industry and progress were now broken skeletons. Entire neighborhoods had vanished. Train stations stood half-collapsed, platforms overrun with weeds. Children played in ruins where houses used to stand. In some places, the returning soldiers were met with silence, no banners, no welcome. In others, civilians lined the roads not to cheer but to stare. To them, these uniformed men returning from American captivity were not heroes. They were reminders of a war that had destroyed everything. One former prisoner remembered, "We had imagined coming home to a proud, wounded nation. Instead, we returned to ghosts, to ruins, hunger, and shame." In Berlin, a city divided among victors, life was survival. Soviet guards patrolled the eastern sectors. In the West, British and American soldiers distributed food to ragged civilians. Those who had come from American camps found themselves explaining, again and again, what it was like over there, and the stories sounded almost impossible. They spoke of the vast farms of Texas and the open kindness of Midwestern families. of being allowed to work for wages, to eat meat and bread every day, to attend English classes or paint murals in camp recreation halls. They spoke of American guards who treated them not as monsters, but as men. Many civilians didn't believe them. Some called them liars or collaborators. You were in America, one woman spat, while we were here starving, but gradually, the truth spread through letters, conversations, and memories shared in bond-out taverns. What the German POWs brought home was not material wealth. It was perspective. They'd seen a world built on freedom, tolerance, and abundance, a world their own government had told them didn't exist, and that realization began to shape the new Germany being born from the ashes. In American-occupied zones, former POWs were often among the first to step forward when rebuilding began. They helped translate, taught English, and worked as mediators between Allied officials and local communities. Some became teachers, engineers, or local administrators. Others simply shared what they had learned about democracy, about responsibility, about the quiet power of fairness. Historians later called it the re-education of a generation, but it hadn't happened in classrooms. It had happened behind barbed wire in the heart of enemy territory. The U.S. military had designed its POW system not just to contain, but to reform. Inside those camps, German soldiers had read newspapers, attended lectures on history and ethics, even participated in debates about the future of Europe. What began as a strategy to prevent rebellion had become something more profound, a blueprint for moral reconstruction, and for many, it worked. A former Wehrmacht lieutenant later reflected, "The Americans did not try to humiliate us. They tried to make us think." That was their greatest victory. By 1947, tens of thousands of repatriated POWs were quietly influencing post-war life. They became a stabilizing force in the Federal Republic of Germany, helping to steer it toward democracy rather than revenge. Their understanding of America's structure, of its laws, its press, its civic order outgave them tools to rebuild something better than what had been destroyed, even in the Soviet zone. Where fear and surveillance reigned, those who had returned from the U.S. were treated with suspicion. Yet their memories persisted like whispered truths that there was another way to live. Another kind of strength, the psychological transformation, was perhaps the most remarkable of all. These were men who had once believed themselves part of a superior nation, destined to dominate. They had laughed at America's softness, yet after years in American camps, they realized that real strength lay not in fear, but in restraint, not in domination, but in decency. Some kept the small tokens given to them by their guards, a lighter, a photograph, a book of poems, reminders of an unexpected humanity discovered far from home years later. When the Marshall Plan began to pour aid into West Germany, many of these former POWs were among its strongest advocates. They understood, better than most, what America's motives were, not conquest, but reconstruction. In their quiet way, they helped bridge two nations once sworn to destroy each other. By the 1950s, some even returned to America, not as prisoners but as immigrants. They found work on the same farms where they had once labored in captivity. Old guards and prisoners met again, this time shaking hands as equals. In the eyes of historians, it remains one of the war's great paradoxes that the men who came to America as enemies left as witnesses to its ideals. They carried those ideals back into a country desperate for guidance, a country that would, within a generation, rise again not through militarism, but through democracy and cooperation. It was not America's weapons that changed them. It was its example. And that quiet transformation, born in wooden barracks and dusty camps thousands of miles from the front, became one of the most overlooked victories of World War II. The war had ended with fire and ruin, but for these men, its true ending came with understanding. Their journey, from laughter at propaganda to awe at liberty, marked the beginning of a new era for them and for the world they helped rebuild. In the quiet that followed war, Germany was a landscape of contradictions. Factories stood silent beside fields overgrown with weeds. Children scavenged for food among the rubble of what were once proud cities. Yet, in this silence, something unexpected began to grow. The faint hum of rebuilding, led in part by men who had once been prisoners an ocean away. By 1946, over 370,000 German POWs had been held in the United States. Nearly all had returned home by 1948. Many came back with strong bodies, well-fed and healthy, but minds transformed. They had seen America's scale, its order, its confidence. For soldiers who had once fought under the banner of dictatorship, those memories stood in sharp contrast to the ruins around them. Some found work in the American occupation zones, translating, rebuilding roads, or assisting local administrations. Their English skills made them valuable. Their new worldview made them different. They were no longer the same men who had left Germany years earlier, eager to fight a war they barely understood. In towns across West Germany, quiet revolutions began inside homes and workshops. Former POWs taught their children about fairness, responsibility, and the rule of law, not as slogans, but as lessons learned through experience. One former sergeant, who had spent 2 years in a camp in Iowa, described it simply: "The Americans did not teach us democracy by lectures. They showed it to us in how they lived." This lived education was the foundation upon which the Federal Republic of Germany would later rise. By the time Konrad Adenauer became chancellor in 1949, a new political climate was emerging, one that valued cooperation with the West over confrontation. The men who had once been POWs now served in the police, civil service, and industry. Many of them, quietly but firmly, advocated for reconciliation with the United States. Their understanding of American pragmatism influenced decisions at every level, from city councils to federal policy. They had witnessed firsthand how a nation could be strong yet compassionate, victorious yet restrained. Historians later called it the POW effect. It was subtle but pervasive, an invisible current that helped steer post-war Germany away from extremism and toward democracy. But not all welcomed them home warmly. In bombed-out neighborhoods, resentment still lingered. Civilians who had endured years of hunger and fear often looked at the returnees with bitterness. "You were safe in America," one mother told her son. "While we dug for potatoes in the snow." The returning men bore this guilt heavily. Many refused to speak of their good treatment in America, believing it would sound like betrayal. Only years later, when wounds had begun to heal, did they share their stories publicly. In 1948, a German magazine published an article titled "Prisoners of Humanity," featuring testimonies from former POWs who described their surprise at how they had been treated. The article spread quickly, translated into several languages. It shocked readers across Europe. The narrative of the enemy was changing. America's handling of its prisoners stood in stark contrast to the brutality seen elsewhere. In Soviet camps, where starvation and forced labor claimed tens of thousands of lives, those who had been captured by the Americans now spoke of fairness and order. While others returned from the East emaciated and broken. It was a quiet triumph of ideals, a demonstration that moral strength could be more powerful than any weapon. And yet, the transformation of these men went beyond politics. It touched something deeper: identity. They began to see themselves not as defeated soldiers of a fallen Reich, but as citizens of a future Germany that could stand without fear. Their respect for America's structure of society, its press freedom, local governance, and civic engagement became blueprints for what would soon be known as the Wirtschaftswunder, the German economic miracle. Factories rebuilt not just from aid, but from mindset. Precision, discipline, and cooperation became the new weapons of progress, and quietly, behind the steel and machinery, lay the memories of barracks thousands of miles away, where men had once watched films about democracy, studied the U.S. Constitution, or debated the meaning of justice under the watchful eyes of American guards. That education, unplanned, improvised, yet profound, had done what armies could not. It had changed hearts. The German POWs had returned not just to rebuild, but to redefine, and in doing so, They became living bridges between two nations that had once sought each other's destruction. The next part of their story would show just how deep that bridge ran as the Cold War dawned and former enemies became allies in the fight for a new kind of peace. When the ships finally brought the German prisoners home, they did not return to the same country they had left behind. Germany was shattered, cities reduced to ash, rail lines twisted, families scattered by years of bombing and hunger. Yet among those stepping off the transport trains were men who carried something invisible but profound. A changed understanding of the enemy they had once sworn to destroy. They had seen a side of America that Nazi propaganda had hidden from them. In the prison camps, they had witnessed order without cruelty, power without arrogance. They had seen guards who treated them not as beasts, but as men. And in that small, human decency, something powerful had taken root, respect. In the years that followed. As the Cold War divided the world into two rival camps, these former prisoners found themselves at the center of a new struggle, one not fought with weapons but with ideas. The United States, now facing the Soviet Union, needed a stable, democratic Germany, and many of the men who had once been POWs in America quietly became the first voices to argue that cooperation with the West was not submission, but survival. They understood the American way of life, the rhythm of its factories, the freedom of its press, and the dignity it granted the ordinary worker. Some became translators for the Allied occupation forces. Others entered politics, education, or journalism. Wherever they went, they carried an experience that made them different from those who had never left German soil. They spoke of an America that was powerful yet generous, confident yet just, a narrative that stood in sharp contrast to the Soviet message sweeping through Eastern Europe. Cultural echoes of their captivity soon followed. Young Germans, curious about jazz and American cinema, found mentors who had once listened to those same songs behind barbed wire. In workshops and classrooms, these veterans shared tales of baseball games between guards and prisoners, of Red Cross parcels filled with chocolate, of debates about democracy that had once seemed unthinkable under Hitler's shadow. Through these stories, admiration replaced hatred. Curiosity replaced suspicion. When the Marshall Plan began in 1948, the ground for acceptance had already been prepared. The United States poured billions into rebuilding Western Europe, and Germany, though humbled, responded with energy and purpose. Many of the men who had known America firsthand supported this alliance. They understood that Reconstruction was not a humiliation, but a chance to start anew. They worked in local administrations, rebuilt industries, and guided towns through the fragile early years of democracy. Their presence helped dissolve bitterness and gave credibility to the idea that Germany could rebuild without vengeance. In time, these men became living bridges, linking to worlds that had once met only in battle. Their memories softened the edges of resentment. They humanized the former enemy, and in doing so, they helped transform Germany from a vanquished nation into America's strongest ally in Europe. By the 1950s, as the Iron Curtain divided the continent, West Germany stood firmly on the side of the democratic West. Its recovery, economic, moral, and political, owed much to the silent influence of those who had once been captives. In the quiet fields of Kansas or the barracks of Texas, they had glimpsed the humanity of their foes. Years later, that memory would help rebuild their own country. Not with hatred, but with understanding. Their story is a reminder that even in war, decency leaves a mark. Sometimes the smallest acts of fairness ripple outward, reshaping nations long after the guns fall silent. And for many of these former POWs, the journey through defeat led, unexpectedly, to the discovery of freedom itself. War has a strange way of revealing humanity in the unlikeliest of places. For the German soldiers who once expected chains and cruelty in America, captivity became something far more profound, an education in freedom. Behind fences lined with barbed wire, they saw the quiet strength of a nation that did not need hatred to prove its power. They saw abundance without arrogance, victory without vengeance. Years later, when they spoke of their time in America, they did not speak of punishment. They spoke of awakening. For men raised on the rigid doctrines of the Reich, the camps in Texas, Iowa, and Oklahoma became classrooms in democracy, not taught by lectures but by simple acts of fairness. A guard sharing coffee, an officer treating a prisoner as a human being, a local family waving from across the field. These small moments mattered because they proved that an enemy could also be a mirror showing what a nation could become once it shed the armor of ideology. And in that reflection, Germany began to rediscover itself. When the war ended, the world could have broken beyond repair. But instead, threads of respect began to weave between the former foes. Those who once stared across battlefields now stood side by side rebuilding factories, schools, and cities. The same hands that had surrendered were now shaping a new Europe, one founded not on fear, but on understanding. The story of the German POWs in America is not one of triumph or humiliation. It is one of transformation. It reminds us that victory can be measured not only by the fall of an enemy, but by the rise of compassion. In the end, the war that divided nations also taught them something enduring, that even in the darkest chapters of history, humanity can still flicker quietly, persistently, lighting the way toward peace.